but I'm just a rock chick.
I would describe my music and my sound as Avril.
It's the best damn thing.
Welcome back to another episode of the Best Damn Avril Lavigne podcast, a facts and trivia-based podcast about Canadian pop singer Avril Lavigne. I'm your host, Andrea DiFrancesco. Now that Avril has wrapped up the most recent leg of her Greatest Hits tour, I thought it would be fun to rank all of her world tours so far to see if the Greatest Hits tour truly is her best tour ever. I had this idea to do a tour ranking episode once the tour wrapped in September. However, then Avril announced she'll be doing a second leg in 2025. So I debated on whether I should wait until the tour officially ends next year to do this episode, but I ultimately decided to just do it anyway, since there probably isn't going to be that many changes to next year's leg. Hopefully maybe a little bit, like maybe some new costumes, maybe a few new songs added in if she has any new music by then, maybe just slightly changing the order of the songs, something like that. But any changes that will be made will probably be pretty minor. And if there are big changes, then maybe we can revisit this episode and do a re-ranking to see where the Greatest Hits tour lands the next time around. But I just thought, what a way, I think, to end this year. I think this will be my last episode for this year. And so I think just considering that she did this big tour this year, that's like the main thing that she did this year, I thought just what a perfect way to end the year by trying to see, like, just talking about this tour and trying to see where I think it ranks amongst her other tours. And so even though she is going to be going back on the road again, it's so funny, like, in the last episode, I talked about, like, I think if there was going to be more dates, I think she would have announced it by now. And then, of course, like a few days after I posted that episode, like it was like a week later, she announced another leg of the tour happening next year. So that's just typical Avril to do that kind of thing to me. But I thought, why not just, even though there is a whole other leg of the tour to go, I thought, why not just do this episode anyway and talk about all of her tours together now that she's done a Greatest Hits tour. And it's sort of like her version of the Taylor's, Eras tour, a tour celebrating her career and everything. And so I thought, how fun would it be to just kind of see, like, compare it to all of her other tours and see where it ranks and if it really is like her greatest tour that she's done. But before we launch into our discussion on Avril's tours, here's a summary of what's happened in Avril news since our last episode. On November 27th, 2 new Funko Pops were released for sale on Avril's website. The figures are inspired by the music videos for Complicated and Girlfriend. On December 2nd, Avril announced a second leg of the Greatest Hits tour to begin in May 2025 and is scheduled to end in June. Opening acts include Simple Plan, We the Kings, and Fifi Dobson. The tour will run through the US and Canada, similar to the 2024 leg. On December 3rd, Part 3 of Season 1 of the children's animated series Angry Birds Mystery Island was released on Amazon Prime, starring Avril as the voice of a new character named Tuba. And on December 6th, Avril uploaded an Instagram reel playing beer pong with the members of Simple Plan as a promotional video for the second leg of the Greatest Hits tour. So with that, let's get into our episode. Now that Avril has at last done a Greatest Hits tour, where does it rank amongst her other tours? And is the Greatest Hits tour truly her best tour? Here's my personal ranking going from worst to best and my reasoning for each. When choosing my ranking, I took many factors into consideration: the setlist, the staging and production, Avril's vocals and energy, whether or not she played any instruments, and so on. There's so many things that go into making a good show, so it's really important to consider everything when creating the ranking, not just my personal favorites. I mean, obviously my personal bias is probably going to fall into this a little bit, and whether or not I've personally been to the shows might influence that as well. It isn't just necessarily always about personal taste or what our personal favorites are, but there are other factors to consider that are more objective qualities about the show, like, how good was the set list, or how good did Avril actually perform during this tour? Was she consistent? And how creative were they with their decisions about how they created the set list and the staging and costumes? And if Avril challenged herself at all with, like, playing instruments or trying new things like dancing, or to do a show that she's never really done before, or to play a different surprise song every night, things like that. Those things definitely count towards, determining what makes a good show, what makes a good tour. Not just like what our personal favorites are. Like, this isn't really my personal favorites. It's just more like objectively going through and actually seeing, like, is this objectively some of her best work? So like I said, I will be going in order from worst to best, or maybe if we don't want to say worst, just weakest, because, I don't like to necessarily use the word worst when talking about her live performances, just because, like, she does put effort into all of her shows and everything. So I don't want to call it like worst necessarily, but if we say maybe the weakest tour to the best tour. So when I considered through all of her world tours that she's done so far, I had to honestly say that I think the Avril Lavigne tour ranks the lowest by default or the weakest by default just because she was sick with symptoms of Lyme disease for almost the entire tour. She started getting sick with Lyme disease around the time that the tour was starting, but she didn't yet know that she had Lyme disease. The shows were delayed sometimes because she was late getting on stage, or the set list had to be shortened because either the show had started late or she herself just couldn't do the entire show because of how sick she was. She was also frequently in the hospital because she was getting dehydrated all the time. And I think they thought that she had the flu and stuff like that. So she was just like fatigued all the time, or she was going to the hospital because of dehydration all the time. And some of the shows even had to be outright canceled because of how sick she was. So I think the show on its own, like I actually attended this tour and I got a really fantastic show from her considering what was going on. I think the set list was pretty decent, like even though a lot of it was the hits and stuff, but she was playing a decent amount of songs from the self-titled album at the time. And they had done some interesting things with like the visuals, like they had that infamous Bad Girl video during that song, and she would wear a special costume when performing that song, and she had like the Hello Kitty costume and things. So she was like doing some interesting things visually and kind of going outside of her comfort zone a little bit with this tour. And I think at least the show that I got to go to, she was vocally pretty on point as well. But I think this tour just by default has to rank the lowest because of what was going on with her at the time. And unfortunately, it kind of puts a big black mark over anything good that might have been going on with that tour. Just because she wasn't having a good time, and the fans, I think, were very worried about her, like wondering why shows were being delayed or why she was playing shortened set lists or why some shows had been outright canceled. Like it was just not a good time for anyone. And I think that honestly, if we could, we'd probably all prefer to forget that this tour ever existed because of it. So unfortunately, the Avril Lavigne tour, even though that was my first time ever getting to see Avril live, and like I personally really enjoyed the show that I went to, I think unfortunately because of how sick she was, I just unfortunately have to put it last in the ranking. Then the next one I put is the Black Star tour. So the tour that was for the Goodbye Lullaby album. And the reason why I rank this one so low, so I know some people might disagree on this one because a lot of people really liked her vocals. But I have to say, I think her vocal ability was definitely like some of her strongest vocals on this tour. But she started doing that weird accent on this tour. Like I think longtime fans will know what I'm talking about, or like if you had watched videos from this concert, you'll kind of know what I'm talking about, where she started singing with this weird accent. And I don't know if like her vocal coach at the time just trained her that way because she wasn't previously singing like that. Like the Goodbye Lullaby era has some of her best live performances in terms of her actual vocal like stamina and her range and the kinds of notes that she was able to hit, and she was able to sustain notes for a long period of time. Her vibrato had improved. Like there were all these things about her technique and her actual vocal ability and like agility and stuff and her range that had improved. But she was at the same time using this really weird accent that sounded completely unnatural. And for me, it just kind of ruined a lot of the performances because it sounded so weird. It sounded so unnatural. And she just like didn't need to be doing all of that. And so I don't know if like her vocal coach at the time was training her that way, or Avril just wasn't maybe understanding what she was supposed to be doing. And she was like overdoing it. Maybe like whatever the vocal coach was telling her to do, like maybe Avril was like overdoing it or something. But it just resulted in this really weird accent that she was doing that I think took away from the performances, frankly. And this is also where the all single set list trend started. So, I mean, it's not surprising that as Avril releases more and more albums that she's going to be performing less and less songs from it, and that she kind of has to perform her hits and stuff. But this is kind of where that trend started, when I think it didn't necessarily need to be starting the fourth album into her career, especially because we all had different, I think, expectations about what the Black Star tour was going to be. She had talked about when the album had come out that she wanted to do a theater tour, like a small kind of intimate theater tour, and it was presumed that she was going to be playing a lot more songs from the album. And I honestly think that could have worked really well if she had done kind of an acoustic theater tour and played a lot more of those songs, especially the ones that she wrote by herself. And if she had maybe accompanied herself on guitar and piano, I think that could have been a really cool different type of show for her. But instead she went for kind of the usual, where she was playing in venues that were too big for her. Like she wasn't even selling those venues out. They were way too big for her. And she was kind of just doing her usual like pop rock show, and, you know, with the band and everything. And I think after the previous tour of the Best Damn Tour, which was kind of the opposite, the Best Damn Tour was super high energy, She had dancers on stage with her, and it was like all this visual excitement going on, and she was like playing instruments and stuff, and all this like a big show going on. And then to kind of like strip it back, I feel like it was kind of just like a step backwards, if I'm being honest. Like I think just in comparison to the previous tour, the Black Star Tour just felt kind of like, yeah, like a step back, in my opinion. And not like, it's fine if she had wanted to do a more stripped back show after doing such a big show like the Best Damn Tour. But I think that there was just a better way of doing it if that's what they wanted to do. Like, it just feels like she didn't really play instruments that much. Like, she played piano on like one song and played guitar on a couple of songs. And it was just kind of her usual. And they were not very creative with the staging. Like, I think, like I said, in comparison to the previous tour of the Best Damn Tour, where there was like all these video screens with visuals on them and like confetti that would come out for the finale and stuff. I think like just in comparison to what we had seen the previous tour, there really wasn't anything going on with the staging this time. It was like she would perform in front of a black curtain, and there was like nothing interesting going on behind her visually. And even like her clothes, like, so I mean, like her first couple tours, she was quite casual with her clothes. Like she didn't have costumes per se. Like she would just wear a t-shirt and jeans or something for the shows, like what she would normally wear. And the Best Damn Tour, they kind of stepped up a little bit. She had some like kind of costume things or like Abby Dawn pieces that she was wearing to kind of make it a little bit more, like make it feel a little bit more like a costume or like a stage outfit and not just her normal clothes. But the Black Star Tour was very weird with her clothes. It's fine if she doesn't want to wear a costume or if she wants to be more casual, she wants to just wear like her normal clothes. That's like fine, I guess. But she would wear almost the exact same shirt every single show. It was the Avril Lavigne Foundation tank top. Like almost every single show, she would wear the exact same thing. And it's not like the same as wearing a costume, because obviously costumes get worn every single show and it's always the same. But it's like her wearing the same thing, but it's not a costume. It's just like a normal piece of clothing, basically, but she's wearing it almost every single show. It was just very odd. And like her wearing her own merch and wearing something with her own face on it was kind of odd. And I don't know, like the only thing I can think about with this Black Star Tour, and I'm sorry for anybody who might have attended and really enjoyed the show, like that's totally valid if you went to the show and you had a great time and you loved it. I personally didn't attend this tour, but just like based on the videos that I had seen from this tour, the only word I can think of to describe it is boring. If I'm being perfectly honest, like, yes, I mean, the set list was full of her hits and very high energy. Like she had a lot of energy with this tour, and her vocals, other than the weird accent, the vocals were on point and everything. But I think I just have to say, in comparison to the tour that we had just seen a few years prior, where it's like we know she can put on a really entertaining show, this by comparison just feels boring. And I think that's why I rank it so low. And I just want to say too, like, even though I'm pointing out some of the good things about this tour, like I will say, like, no matter where these tours are in my ranking, I think that every tour has its pros and cons. Like, I don't think any of her tours are outright like, this is the worst thing that she's ever done. Like, I think every tour, even the ones that I would rank more towards the bottom, they have their positives. Like I said, even with the Avril Lavigne tour, even though she was sick for most of it, like I personally attended that tour and she gave a phenomenal show. And they still tried to find ways to be creative with some of the songs and stuff. So it's like, I think every show has had like its good things and bad things. So I don't want anyone to think that just because I've ranked a show low, that it necessarily means it's awful or anything. Every show has its pros and cons, but I'm just giving my reasons for why I ranked them where I did. And for me, it's just the Black Star Tour. I mean, this is also the first tour of hers where we didn't get a DVD either. So I think that also kind of influences my opinion of it, where it just kind of started to feel like this is where her career kind of started to, I don't want to say like go downhill, but like I think she kind of started to fade out a little bit from the mainstream. Like she wasn't quite as big, like the Best Damn Thing was like a really big like bang of an era for her. And unfortunately, the Black Star Tour, the Goodbye Lullaby era, there was just like so much time between those albums. And like I said, she was initially planning to do like an intimate acoustic theater kind of tour with this album. And then they just went for a big arena tour, and she was barely filling up like half the arenas with this tour. And so I think just like the concept of this tour just didn't work. I think that's what it is for me. I think that's why this ranks so low for me. So again, I know that there's definitely people who rank this tour very high because to them it was like a rock show. Like some people really hated the Best Jam tour because it was like all girly and pop and like a big pop production. They totally hated that. So totally valid. People were like, oh, the Black Star tour, this is like the Avril that we know. Like she's back kind of to like being the rocker chick that we know. So like I get it if that's why people rank this one really high. But for me personally, I rank this one lower because of the concept. Like I think the concept just didn't work, or it doesn't even really have a concept, which is fine. Like not all of her tours really had concepts either. Like her early ones didn't really have concepts. But I think there's just something about this one. Either the concept really isn't very clear, like it doesn't really have a concept, or if it does have a concept, like if the concept is just supposed to be stripped down and like a rock show kind of thing, like her typical rock show, I guess you could say, I think it just doesn't work with this album. Like I think her original idea of an acoustic intimate theater tour would have been so much better, would have been so different for her. I don't know how well it would have been received. Like maybe that's why they didn't do it, because like commercially maybe that was like more of a niche thing for her like hardcore fans, and maybe they just thought it wasn't going to sell that well. And I don't know the reasoning why they ended up changing it, and it may not have been Avril's decision necessarily, so I totally get that. But I personally think that for the type of album that Goodbye Lullaby was, I think that this type of tour, it just didn't make sense. It didn't align with the type of album that Goodbye Lullaby was. And I think the concept, it's like one of those things that maybe sounded good on paper, but the execution just wasn't there. And so that's why this one ranks lower for me. Okay, and then this is kind of the one that is the last one that's more towards the lower end. It's kind of tied in another place with another tour. Like I kind of wasn't sure if it was this one or the other one that like which place they were in. So they're almost kind of tied for me. But the last one that's more on the lower end for me is the Love Sucks tour. I'm not really including the Bite Me tour on this, but they're both kind of the same tour. So I'm just encompassing all of them into the Love Sucks tour. So the Love Sucks tour ranks lower for me because the set list was kind of short. I mean, her set list, even like for the Greatest Hits tour, is also short, but I'll explain later about why I think that's okay in that case, but not necessarily in this case. So the set list for the Love Sucks tour was pretty short, and there was a lot of inconsistency with her vocals and energy. This was when she was in Europe and like the Tyga stuff was going on and everything. And I don't know like what was going on with her, if there was something going on physically or emotionally that like contributed to that. Like I think I remember talking about that when the tour was happening, and I had done some previous episodes talking about my perception of that tour and kind of how I was feeling about the way it was going. But I do remember that she was quite inconsistent with her performance. And I think she was like drinking a lot and smoking and those kinds of things. And then she got sick at one point as well. So I don't know if like all those things is what caused her to get sick, or, you know, what was the reason why she got sick. But I do remember she got sick at one point. She lost her voice, and like she did the show anyway, but she couldn't really perform. And so the crowd was doing most of the singing. So yeah, there was just like a huge inconsistency through that whole tour run where she was like, frankly, not on her A game. And that's like a different case than like the Avril Lavigne tour, where obviously the sickness was out of her control, and it wasn't just like a normal sickness. It was something drastic had happened to her, and she didn't even know what was going on yet, but she was still like trying to do the best that she could. Here, I feel like with the Love Sucks tour, it was probably preventable sickness, or at least it wasn't like as drastic as what had happened to her on the Avril Lavigne tour. And I feel like she just wasn't taking the best care of herself. I mean, I don't want to say too much about that because I don't know. Obviously, like I don't know the specifics about what was going on with her at that time and what she was doing or wasn't doing to prepare for the tour and like to kind of keep herself healthy. So like for all I know, it could just be, you know, allergies or Lyme flare up or something else that happened to her that like wasn't, you know, her fault. But like at the same time, we did see she was going out to bars and staying out late and drinking, and she was like posting Instagram stories of her smoking like weed and stuff. And like none of that contributes to a healthy performance environment. So I just am like, especially if she got so sick that she lost her voice, like she did end up working with her vocal coach to get her voice back. So like why she lost her voice, you know, that could have been something that again was out of her control. We don't really know. But I just think if it's so bad that you're losing your voice, then, I mean, that can happen to even the best of singers who use the best of techniques. Like those things happen. But I feel like, I don't know, there's just something about that tour that something felt very off about it. Because this was just after she had decided to call off her engagement with Maude, and then all the Tyga stuff happened. And it just seemed like she was not in the best headspace maybe to be doing a tour at that moment. Like, again, I don't want to say too much because I don't know. And like, again, there are some people who probably went to that tour and had an amazing time, and that's totally valid. But just like as an outsider viewing it from the outside, and from what I know about vocal performance and vocal care and healthy technique and how to create a healthy environment so that you can perform at your optimum, like I think Avril just wasn't doing the best that she probably could be in that aspect. And we saw the results of it, unfortunately. So that is why the Love Sucks tour ranks rather low for me, because there was just that inconsistency with her performance, her vocals, her energy just like frankly wasn't there, on top of having that short set list and having things like Love Sucks on the drums thrown in there. And then sometimes in an earlier part of the tour, when she was still with Maud, she would do Flames in the set. Like, it just, the set list didn't make any sense. And she would have like all these random things in there that were taking the place of other songs that she could be doing. Playing a brief portion of Love Sucks on the drums, like she could have just played the whole song. There was no need to have that segment on the drums. She wasn't performing the whole song. Like, it just didn't really contribute anything to the set list. But the thing that kind of makes it rank above the other two tours for me is that at least there was some creative staging and production and costumes. Like, at least if the set list was going to be kind of her usual and she wasn't very consistent in her performance level, at least there was some creativity going on with the way that they did the visual elements. And there was like confetti cannons from what I remember. It's kind of like, it was so long ago, I kind of like don't remember as much, and her tours are kind of starting to blend together for me. But from what I remember, I think there was like things with confetti cannons and stuff like that. And the costumes that were designed by Ashton Michael, which were really cool and really suited her, and just kind of elevated it just a little bit more to make you feel like you were seeing a show and not just a concert. So that's the thing that is kind of its saving grace for me, is that at least if nothing else, there was some creativity with the visual parts of it. Okay, so now we're kind of flipping into the portion of the ranking that's like, it's starting to get better now. Like, these are kind of what I think are her stronger tours. So the Head Above Water tour is next in my ranking, and it's kind of in the middle. Like, I wasn't sure if I should rank Head Above Water and then Love Sucks, or Love Sucks and then Head Above Water. So they're kind of like tied for me for different reasons, but I would rank the Head Above Water tour above Love Sucks just a little bit. So it's kind of like, it falls more in the middle. Like, I don't think it's the most amazing tour that she's done, but I think it's far from being her worst tour. And unfortunately, she didn't really get much of a chance with this tour either, because of how short it was, because it got cut short due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then all of those shows that were delayed because of COVID ended up getting transferred into the Love Sucks tour. So it's kind of like a weird thing. But just talking about the Head Above Water tour as it was the Head Above Water tour. So this is another tour that I got to attend personally, and I think she gave a really good show considering that it was her first tour back after having Lyme disease. So that's kind of one of the things that contributes to me for like ranking where it does, is that there was, I think, some hype around this tour, at least amongst her hardcore fans, because like we didn't know what was happening when she was sick with Lyme disease. We didn't know if she was ever gonna be able to tour again. And so I think there was definitely some hype when, like 5 years later, she finally gets back on the road and gets to tour again. And I know personally when she walked out on that stage, like after that Head Above Water video intro, and knowing what she had been through, and then coming out to the stage and seeing her, and I was like very close to the stage. Like that time my seats were very close to the stage, so it was a much smaller, more intimate venue, and getting to see her like more up close and personal was very emotional. And I got like a little tear in my eye. Like I think I cried like a little bit when she first appeared on stage, because it was so emotional to see her after all that time and after what she had been through. And like she delivered, I think, a really good show considering her health condition at the time. Like it wasn't as high energy as her early performances, of course, but I think considering what she had been through, she did like the best that she could for what she was able to do at that time, I think. And I also appreciate that the set list was a little bit more varied, maybe than some of her later ones ended up being. So like it was still a lot of the hits and everything, and still very much like a rock show, I guess you could call it. But I do think she brought back some of her lesser played songs. So like we did have a few songs from Head Above Water, and I like that she rotated one every few shows. We would get either Tell Me It's Over, It Was In Me, or Warrior. And so I like that she did at least like I think they all should have been part of the set list, probably to begin with. So like, she was still doing the short set list and playing more of the hits than the album tracks and that usual thing that she does with her set list. But at least there was some attempt to kind of rotate. If we couldn't have them as part of the set list permanently, at least she was rotating them every few shows, and you didn't necessarily know which song you were going to get. So it was sort of like almost like doing a surprise song, even if the song wasn't always different, and we sort of knew it was going to be this one, or this one. But I like that there was that sort of surprise element to it, that, you know, you didn't necessarily know which one you were going to get. And I got Tell Me It's Over, which I was happy about because that's like one of my favorite songs on the album. So it kind of does make it feel like that much more special when she does things like that. Like I said, she also brought back some lesser played songs as well. Like she did Keep Holding On. She did a little bit of Breakaway. And she brought back When You're Gone, I think, for the first time since the Black Star Tour. So she brought back some songs that don't always get played. And, you know, I think there was just like a little bit more variety to that set list than maybe some of her previous ones. And even though it was a quite bare bones production, I think they tried to attempt to do interesting things with like the screens behind her. So it wasn't just like nothing behind her like the Black Star Tour. But yeah, the production was rather kind of bare bones. And it was, like I said, a much smaller, more intimate tour because since it was her first tour back in many years, I think they didn't really know what the reception was going to be like. So they had her playing in much smaller theaters. So, you know, they had to keep the production smaller. So I think that's kind of why it ranks more in the middle because, you know, I think she was doing the best that she could do under the circumstances of like she was taking it easy because of her health. They didn't want to put her in these massive venues that she maybe wouldn't be able to sell out. She was doing a rather short, like an hour-long set list because she probably didn't know what her stamina was like. The production was kept pretty, you know, basic because they were playing in these smaller venues and stuff. But she did play instruments. Like it was cool to see her play on the piano a couple songs, and she brought out her guitar and everything. And she had like some different outfits that she would wear throughout the show, or outfits that would vary from show to show, and like the little wings that she would wear. So there was at least like some creativity, I think, that wasn't present on some of those earlier tours that I had mentioned. And I think too, what gives this tour maybe the edge over some of the others is that it has that special feeling to it, that it is her first tour back after being sick for so long, and we didn't really know, like she didn't know, we didn't know if she was going to be able to ever tour again. And so I think, you know, that kind of special feeling of seeing her back and doing what she loves to do, I mean, you can't beat that. You know, like I think that kind of sentimental, that emotional part of it gives it the edge maybe over some of the other tours as well. So now we're at the part of the ranking where I would say this is when we're getting into the really good, really strong tours. So starting with the Try to Shut Me Up tour. So this was her first headlining tour. And while I would say that I think vocally it's definitely not as good as her future tours would end up being, because like, I mean, she was 18 years old. She was brand new to touring. I don't think she really had a technique yet. And I don't think she knew the best way to take care of her voice. So vocally, it's, I think, further down the list as far as that aspect goes. And the set list is also quite limited because she only had one album. But on the plus side, that means we got to hear every single song performed live, which that is the only album so far in her career where we actually have been able to hear every single song on that album performed live. So it does kind of have that as something that sets it apart from her other tours, is that we actually got to hear the entire album that the tour is for, like the supporting album, performed in its entirety. And that makes it pretty special. That sets it apart from her other tours. But then, like I said, on the like negative side of that, like Avril herself has said that she was frustrated with that she, you know, there was only a few hits on that record and that's all she had as far as what would be a crowd pleaser. And so she kind of didn't like that she was having to perform these lesser known album tracks. So I guess like depending on how you look at it, that could be either a positive or a negative. But I think what also makes this tour rank higher for me, like in spite of the fact that it was her first tour, she probably didn't really have a good idea of what she was doing, and her vocals were not quite there yet, and the set list was limited because of only having one album at the time. But I think in spite of all those things, I also think that she had really good energy on this tour because she was only 18 years old and she was like really excited for it being her first tour. And that was kind of when she was very much about like her rock chick image and stuff. So she was like running around all over the stage and jumping up and down. And this is her only tour besides the Greatest Hits tour where she invited a couple people from the crowd on stage to sing with her. So that's like another really cool thing that makes it special and sets it apart from the other tours. And I also think for us longtime fans who have been around since the beginning of Avril's career, this tour, I think when you watch the My World DVD or any performances from this tour, it is so nostalgic. I think the nostalgic value is kind of what, that might be a bias of mine, but I think the nostalgic value really contributes to the high ranking of this tour because she had her original band with her. And I think anybody who has followed her career since the very beginning have always loved seeing when Avril was with her band, that original band that she had. They were all like friends with each other. She would describe them as like her brothers, and just the way that they would kind of play with each other on stage and like mess around and like kind of push each other around and stuff and just kind of act silly and goof around and stuff. She never had that with any of her other bands. Not that her other bands haven't been good. Like all of her other bands have been very good players, very professional. And, I think she has enjoyed all of her bandmates that she's always had and had a bond with her bands, but not like this one. I think we can all kind of agree that that original band that she had, she will just never have. Like that was just like lightning in a bottle, that original band that she had, the friendship that they all had, and the way that they would get along with each other, especially her and Evan, the way that they would get along with each other. And also like those moments where they would really be there for each other. So like that infamous show where Avril found out before the show in Dublin that her grandfather had passed away just a few hours before she was due to go on stage. And Avril pushed through that show. And at the end of it, her band came around and gave her a hug. And just those kinds of moments. And like, I remember in the My World documentary, it's called Anything But Ordinary. It's a documentary that was aired by ABC Family called Anything But Ordinary. And I remember her drummer, Matt, talking about how he was so impressed that, Avril was so young and she was like thrust into fame practically overnight. And she was doing this tour all around the world, like places she had probably never dreamed of going to, didn't even know existed. And she was putting her body like physically through a lot. And she was so young. Like, it's crazy to think at 18 years old that she was doing a tour of that scale and selling out arenas and stuff all over the world. And Matt was talking about how he was so impressed that like she hadn't crumbled under the pressure. Like half the time she didn't know where she was because she was in a different city every day. And her body was just like breaking down because she wasn't eating properly and she was in different time zones all the time and not getting enough sleep and all this kind of stuff. And so I think that's also something that really contributes to the high ranking of this tour is just like the novelty of it, with it being her first tour and the nostalgia behind it. And for being how young and inexperienced she was, how she was able to still like pull through the way that she did and like deliver these high energy shows night after night after night. So I think for me, that is why I put this one higher up on my list personally. Okay, so now we are getting into our top 3 of this tour ranking. And there's probably going to be some disagreements, and that is totally fine. But at number 3, I have the Bones tour. And I know that that is probably very controversial, that a lot of people would rank this number 1. And that is totally valid. I understand, that is totally fine. But I will tell you why I have it placed at number 3. As we all know, the Bones tour, that was her second tour for the Under My Skin album. And it was a very long tour as well. I think it might still be her longest tour to date in terms of how many shows. It was like 145 shows over the course of a year. So this was a very lengthy tour, and it was only her second tour at the time. And she was maybe like 19, 20 years old when this tour was happening. So she was still very, very young, very early on in her career. But her vocals had improved so much by the time this tour happened, like definitely a huge step above the Try to Shut Me Up tour. And what I think we also all love about the Bones tour is that she played a lot of instruments on this tour. She would frequently accompany herself on piano or guitar. Like she was either playing those instruments, like playing piano or playing guitar or even playing drums. Or there was like a couple songs on the set list. It was Nobody's Home and Slipped Away, where she was basically accompanying herself. And so like she really challenged herself to do more as an artist, like to not just improve her vocal ability, but also to play instruments, and not just play instruments, but do a couple songs completely by herself without the band. I think if you think about it, that's a really intimidating thing to do when you're in front of like thousands and thousands of people. And she's never been terribly confident in her instrument playing abilities. And so I think that was definitely showed a sign of growth, like artistic growth, that she challenged herself to want to play instruments in front of people without having kind of the safety net of her band behind her. And I would also say that the set list for this tour, I think, is very strong, despite the fact that there were only 2 albums. So like it was a little bit better than the Try to Shut Me Up tour in terms of variety, because now she had 2 albums of songs to draw from, but the set list was still limited because of that. But obviously for people who like the Under My Skin album, like this is the tour where she played every single song except for one on the set list, and then some other hits and favorites from the Let Go album as well. So I think the set list, considering that she only had 2 albums to work with, I think she made a pretty good set list with like what she had to work with. And then also in the Bones Tour documentary, you can see that she was really thoughtful in how she put together the set list, because she, like, you can kind of see her putting it together, and she didn't have as much time as she wanted to be able to figure out the set list. And so she kind of, again, worked with what she had. Like, she didn't have as much time as she wanted, so she did what she could. And she was like very intentional about the way that the songs were put. Like, you know, I want to go from this song to this song. I don't want any periods of silence here. And, you know, this is how I want to do this and that. And I think the set list was put very thoughtfully together. But the only reason why it ranks as third for me is just because I think these other 2 rank above it for other reasons. So it's not that I think just because the Bones Tour is in third place for me doesn't mean at all that I think it's a bad tour. I think it's just because it's so limited with only having 2 albums of songs in it. But I think in spite of that, I still think it's a very, very strong showing from her. Like, the Bones Tour Live in Budokan DVD, every fan knows that the Bones Tour Live in Budokan is peak performance from her. It is like one of the all-time best shows of her entire career is that show. And like, if somebody has never heard of Avril, never seen her perform before, that this is like one of the performances that you point people to. So by no means do I think that it is a weak tour or anything at all, or a bad tour. It's just that I think the last 2 are a little bit better. They kind of have other things going for them that outrank this one for me. But again, I totally understand that there are some people who are like, no, Bones Tour #1 all the way. She will never beat the Bones Tour. So I totally get that. But that brings me to the Best Damn Tour being number 2. And I will tell you why the Best Damn Tour is number 2 for me. For the longest time, it was, in my opinion, her best tour. I thought it was her strongest tour because I think, you know, just based on the Live in Toronto DVD, because I personally didn't get to go to this tour, so I just have the Toronto DVD to go off of. But I think she had stellar vocals and great energy for this show. And what I really liked about this tour, so again, I know I had referenced this before, that some people probably absolutely hate this tour because of these things, but this is what I like about this tour, is that it has a little bit of everything and something for everybody to enjoy in this tour. I feel like it's her most balanced in terms of like all the things that it includes. She tried dancing for the first time, which I know, you know, some people are like, oh, I hated when she tried dancing. And yeah, she isn't the greatest dancer. I will agree with that. But I think if there was any tour to try dancing with, it was this one. Like, this is the one that just makes the most sense for that. So like, if she wanted to get it out of her system and experiment with it and try it, this was the tour to do that. And again, it just shows that she tried to challenge herself and do a different type of show than she'd ever done before. And I think it's okay for her to try things, even if the result is like maybe not that great, or if it doesn't turn out the best, then that's okay. Like, you know, Avril will never grow as an artist if she doesn't try things outside of her comfort zone. And like, yeah, failure is part of the process. Like, everybody fails when trying new things. And so I think it's not a surprise that maybe she wasn't such a great dancer. And I think she knew she wasn't a great dancer, but I think she just wanted to try it in the songs that made sense, like where it fit. And she did the type of dancing that she could do that like made sense with her abilities, I guess. And so, you know, if you don't like dancing, that's fine. But, for, you know, for people who do like dancing, it's like it had dancing, but then it also had, it's like if you don't like dancing, then that's fine, because there were other portions of the show where she was like just doing her usual like rock chick thing. She played instruments, she played guitar and piano and drums. There was a mixture of like her usual fast, upbeat pop rock songs, but then there was also the ballads. And I think the set list is probably the strongest set list that she's made in terms of having to do like an album tour, like not a greatest hits tour, like a tour that is meant to promote an album. I think it's her most balanced set list with a really good variety of new and old songs. So like she played the majority of songs from the Best Damn Thing album, but then she also brought back the fan favorites from the previous 2 albums. And so it was just enough of like old and new together without feeling like, you know, I really want to hear more Under My Skin songs. Like, you know, it wasn't that kind of show. Like, we weren't feeling like we were missing anything from the previous albums. Like, she, you know, brought back the hits that are the ones that people wanted to hear the most. And then the rest of the set list time was devoted to the new album. And that's the way that it should be. I also think that this tour had great production and staging. Like for its time, for being 2008, I don't know how many artists were doing tours like this. I'm not too up on my like pop shows, from that time. So I could be wrong. But I think for its time, I mean, now we're so used to tours that are on like big production scales like this. But for its time, and especially for Avril, she had never done anything like this. There was like all kinds of stuff going on with the video screens behind her, and she had her custom made like pink instruments and costumes, and there was confetti that would come out at the end. The dancers with the flags, and like there was a dance break in the middle of it while she was doing a costume change. Like all these things that really made it feel so much more like a show and not just a concert. And it was unlike anything she had ever done. And it also had to really live up to its name of being the best damn tour. So they really had to put a lot of thought behind how they made this show. And I think that comes across when you watch it. I have to say, I have watched the Live in Toronto DVD a lot of times by now. And every time I watch it, like no matter how many times I've seen it, I always enjoy watching it. And I think it just has such a great kind of entertainment value to it. And like, I remember once I wasn't feeling very well and I was just laying in bed and I just felt like watching this show. Like I just felt like watching something that was kind of comforting and familiar to me. And it really did make me feel better when I watched it because it was comforting and familiar to me. But also like, it's just such a great put together show and so entertaining, and I think really encompasses everything, like the best parts of Avril, the parts of her that are just like that, upbeat, like rock chick that really likes just rocking out and screaming and running around all over the stage. But then also, when she just sits on a stool and sings a ballad and she gets out her acoustic guitar. And I think it just like kind of brings together all the things that we love about the type of performer and the type of artist that Avril is. And I just think it's just up there with being one of the best tours that she's ever done. And like I said, for the longest time, to me, it was her best tour. It was like the number one tour for me until she did what I now think is her best tour, which is, to probably no one's surprise, the Greatest Hits Tour. So the reason why I think the Greatest Hits Tour does deserve to be named her best tour so far is because it is her biggest scale production to date. It has all of her iconic hits in one show, which I know before we've harped on, when she does these all singles set lists, but at least this is like billed as being that. Like it's not pretending to be anything else. It's not like this is a tour named after my latest album, but I'm barely playing anything from it and I'm playing all my hits. Like this is billed as a Greatest Hits Tour. And so I think considering that it's being marketed as a Greatest Hits Tour, it's meant to be like the ultimate celebration of her career. I think it is what it's being sold as. Like, I think it lives up to its name of being the Greatest Hits Tour. It's meant to be a celebration of all of her past work. And even like with the little, all the visual cues that are in the videos and her costumes, like all these little kind of nods and Easter eggs to her past albums, and the little video interludes, like the one where there's like the career highlights and stuff, and the video intro where all her album logos are appearing on screen, and they have the balloons that come out on stage that are some of her past logos and stuff. I just think, how can you not, as an Avril Lavigne fan, if you have been a fan since the very beginning, this is like the ultimate tour to, like, if you can only go to one tour of hers, this is kind of the ultimate tour for like Avril Lavigne fans, I think. Again, it's kind of like her version of the Eras Tour, but obviously on a much smaller scale, but kind of the same idea. Like I said, it's her biggest scale production to date. Like I personally went to this tour and I thought she put on a great show. And I was just so impressed with the logistics, I guess, of how big of a stage show this was. And the fact that she is playing arenas again and that she was selling out so many venues and playing to huge packed crowds of thousands of people, kind of akin to her early tours, which we never thought we'd see that again. So I think that's the other thing that makes this tour really special, is to kind of see her come full circle from like where she began, that she was playing to huge crowds like this, very enthusiastic crowds and people that are so enthusiastic to come see the show, and they're dressing up like her and stuff and pulling fans up on stage and giving them skateboards and stuff. And like I said, it's just like an ultimate celebration of her career as a whole and not just focusing on one particular album or one specific era. And her vocals have been really on point, like unlike the Love Sucks tour, which happened not too much earlier before this tour. Her vocals and her energy have been pretty consistent. Like she's maybe had a couple off nights here and there, but I think on the whole, I think she's been largely very consistent throughout the Greatest Hits tour. And I hope that continues into the next year's leg. But I think whatever happened with that Love Sucks tour, I think she maybe hopefully learned a lesson from it and learned like, oh, I do have to really be careful with how I take care of myself and prevent myself from getting sick and all those things. And I think she's been so much more consistent with her performance. And it really shows like when she comes out to perform, like you can tell that she is really, I think, putting a lot of thoughtfulness behind like, you know, giving the best show that she can give every single night. And yeah, I mean, I think as somebody who just like, maybe if you haven't seen the show in person, you might be kind of like, oh, really? This is like, that's what you think is the best tour? Like, it's so basic. But I think if you've actually been to the show in person, or if you get a chance to go on this next leg, I think you'll see what I mean, that I think it's just like the quintessential show for any Avril fan, especially if you've been a fan since the beginning of her career and like you grew up on her music or you have kids of your own that you're getting them into her music. I mean, I think that's the other thing about this tour. Like I said, it's very similar to Taylor's Eras tour, where there's like people who are going to this tour that grew up with her and even bringing their own kids that are also getting into her music. And so it's multi-generational and it's spanning the 20 plus years that Avril has been active in music. And like I said, I mean, those few years before where we like didn't know if she was ever going to be able to tour again. And then the pandemic hit and nobody knew what the touring industry was going to be like going forward. And so I think having the Greatest Hits tour, like I said, the only way I can think of to describe it is just the ultimate celebration of her career. I just like, how can that not be the best tour? How can that not be the number one tour? And what she's going to do from here, I don't know, because it's kind of like similar with the Taylor's Eras tour. Like, how is she ever going to top that? I don't know. But I think I have to say, like, you know, once Avril does another tour, I can come back and do a re-ranking and see if I think the Greatest Hits tour gets knocked down from whatever her next tour is going to be. But I think for now, considering all these tours that we've had over the last 20 years and all the things that Avril has had to endure with just, you know, navigating the music industry, the challenges that come with that on its own, but then her health challenges and her any kind of like personal challenges that she's been through in her personal life. And then the COVID-19 pandemic, like having to bounce back from all of those obstacles that have happened in the last 20 years. And then to come out with something like the Greatest Hits tour, where it is a celebration of her career and it's like bigger and better than anything she's ever done. And she really wanted to make it special for the fans. And like, I think just inviting fans up on stage and giving them signed skateboards is a really nice touch. And showing that she really appreciates the fans for sticking with her for this long. You know, I think it just shows that she still cares about challenging herself, like to some degree. Like, even if, you know, I would like for her to maybe do some surprise songs in the set list or something. You know, I think it shows that her love for doing this, like that she still loves performing and that she wants to do this and that she wants, you know, the fans have love to give to her and she wants to give that love back. And there's like just no better venue to do that than the Greatest Hits tour. I just think when you put all those special things, all those special little things together, like just how can it not be number one? How can the Greatest Hits tour celebrating the career of Avril Lavigne, how can that not be her best tour? It would almost be kind of embarrassing if it didn't live up to its name. So that is personally why I rank it number one. So while I think the Greatest Hits tour is ultimately deserving of the title of Avril's best tour, I'm curious to know what your ranking would be. Let me know over on the podcast Instagram page at Best Damn Avril Pod. Time will tell if the Greatest Hits tour can continue to live up to its name as Avril brings it back on the road next year, and if there might be any changes to the set list or new costumes. But until then, we conclude this edition of the Best Damn Avril Lavigne podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your preferred podcast platform so you can get new episodes directly in your feed. And please don't forget to take a minute to leave a rating or review to help more fans find the show. We're currently streaming on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, Amazon Music, and Audible. Be sure to join me again next time, or next year, on the Best Damn Avril Lavigne podcast. The Best Damn Avril Lavigne podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Andrea DiFrancesco. Theme music is HD and Lights by J. Powell Flicks. Follow the latest podcast news on Instagram at bestdamnavrilpod or email bestdamnavrilpod@yahoo.com.
Bye.